Hey everyone, okay, this is the second half of the lesson for today. So you had two videos, organizational communication. Now we're going to talk about media and sort of creating narratives within the media. Uh, the PowerPoint that I'm using is based off a presentation I gave for a conference a couple weeks ago. It's just some updated things that I have from my usual lecture. Uh, so yeah, just kind of keep that in mind as we go through it. All right. So what we're talking about today is not just media credibility when we have this sort of vocabulary around this idea of fake news and what is fake news and trying to decipher and everything. Um, but what we're really talking about is sort of how the media creates narratives in our lives. All right. And what I mean by that is sort of the way in which we know a lot of the world is based on what we get through media, and what we're doing is we're sort of recreating those narratives when we go out in the world and we sort of talk to people face to face, right? So the only way in which we can know what a news story says is from news anchors, and depending on the news anchors we listen to, we could be getting very different stories than the person who's sitting right next to us in the classroom. All right. So what we're going to talk about is not just how to decipher and read the news, but just making sure that we're reading the news with a critical eye, and that we're sort of doing our very best to go beyond just what is sort of put in front of us in our social media feeds or a 5-minute clip on your favorite cable news channel, and just kind of always remembering that there's a bigger story behind the small amount of information that the news gives us, right? Even if we're talking about like, a write-up in the New York Times, let's say it's 1,000, 2,000 words. That's relatively short, right? Maybe 4 or 5 pages in a Microsoft Word document, right? That's about, 1 to 2,000 words, about 4 to 5 pages, okay? You take that and you have to realize that there's a lot of information that went into just creating that small little document. A lot of reading, a lot of context, a lot of interviews. You can interview someone for an hour and a half, and then it sort of all boils down to like one paragraph worth of quotes. And so you, as a consumer of the media, just have to be aware when it comes to putting all this information in context, and then yeah, just looking at the media with a critical eye. That's the big thing. It's always a question of, have they left anything out? Is there a different way to sort of understand this material? The media, I'm not saying the media is lying or that's fake news, but this idea that the media is telling me the truth, but maybe they're just omitting information. Maybe it's unconscious, maybe it's completely conscious, but maybe it's just unconscious for the sake of time, right? You have an hour-long speech that the president gives, the media it only has enough time to show you a 30-second clip. That's going to be a problem with sort of figuring out whether or not the president gave a good speech or a bad speech, because I'm missing so much of the speech. I'm only watching what the media wanted me to watch. Okay, so here's an example from a couple weeks ago. So the first thing that I want to do with students is just being straightforward, right? When it comes to, yes, the media does make errors, right? There are corrections that are issued. There is a ethical way to go through a process of correcting errors that the media does time to time, right? Various media outlets do this from time to time. They come through and they say, look, somebody was misquoted, or there was some extra context that we missed, and so the way in which we wrote this story up was out of context. So the media does this, right? So the media makes errors. Now, this doesn't mean that it's fake news. It just means that when the media is putting together a story, most of the time that story is sort of rushed, right? Because they're under a deadline, right? If an event happens today, they have to put it in tonight's newscast. And so not all the facts, they might not be in front of us yet. If we think about some of the sort of like high profile criminal situations, right? You think about the ways in which you understand that media moment, and usually it's like, this happened today, and it blows up all over social media. But the actual criminal trial for that event doesn't happen for like a year. And the reason it doesn't happen for a year is because the lawyers know that it takes a long time to get all of the evidence and get everything in order to make sure that they are telling the totality of the story, as opposed to just giving you quick little sound bites. So for instance, right now we are in the middle of the trial of Derek Chauvin, who was involved with the killing of George Floyd, right? And if we remember, like when that happened about a year ago, about this time last year, it was all over the media, right? And it was just blasted out. And all of us got information, but the problem is that all of us got different information or some conjecture, or we might have gotten information, but then it was misleading information, or there was information we got and it was there was some information that was omitted. So we didn't get all the facts of the case, right? We saw the video and then we're like, okay, we know everything. Well, we think we know everything. But the people who actually have to sort of try this in a court of law, they don't say, let's make a judgment now, 5 seconds after we all saw the tape. They say, okay, we need a year to get witnesses, contextualize the situation. We need some background information on all these people who were involved. So it takes a long time. So this is why the media can trip over themselves sometimes. And it feels like it's fake news when really it's just media's trying to rush a story out. And they're like, we have the best story right now and we don't know all the information. Another sad situation that recently happened up in Brooklyn, Minnesota, I believe. A young man was shot by a police officer just a few days ago, which I'm sure you all have seen all over the news. And you probably have also seen in the last 3 or 4 days since it happened is more details come out, right? Now, this isn't a judgment on who's guilty or innocent or whether it's justified or unjustified. It's simply this sort of, how does the media tells you the initial story, right? A young 20-year-old black man killed by a police officer during a traffic stop, right? And you see that and then the media writes it up quickly and they put it out. But then the slow drip of details comes out for the next, few days to several months. And it helps us to tell a more complete story. And in telling a more complete story, we might have to go back to the beginning and say, the way in which we originally framed this story might have been a little misleading, or there might have been some details omitted, or if you would have known more of those details, maybe you would have had a different reaction to the original event. And so this is kind of what happens in sort of telling media narratives, is they rush out information because they have to get it on the news. But then the more we learn, the more we look back and say, maybe my initial emotional reaction was misinformed, right? If I would have known all these other details, I would have just sort of saw this situation as different, all right? So that's what happens with regard to sort of media and the errors and the omissions and everything else that comes from it. It's a very, sometimes people call the media the first draft of history, which I think is true, but there's also needs to be a recognition that, nobody turns in the first draft of their paper, right, for a class. It's like, it's the first draft of history, but we know that first draft of history is we go back and we edit it and we clean it up and we sort of change some things and we say, okay, I wasn't completely clear on this, right? But that's what the media is. It's getting out information quick, and sometimes that information can be bad. All right, so an example of where the media recently had a bit of a screw up. 60 Minutes hasn't fully copped to this, but plenty of other media outlets have called them out on it. So in full disclosure, this is a situation. A couple weeks ago, Governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, had this interview with 60 Minutes about the vaccine rollout for the coronavirus in his state, and 60 Minutes was trying to cobble together the story about the vaccine rollout, and it was being released in this place called Publix, which is like this huge grocery store in Florida, and Publix had donated some money to this campaign. So they're trying to make all these puzzle pieces fit together in this kind of clunky way. Ron DeSantis and other people explain like these things were not fitting together in any sort of way, like campaign donations and the vaccine and this grocery, like they had nothing to do with it. Lots of other people in the state of Florida said that nothing to do with it, like this is not a story. And Ron DeSantis is a Republican governor, but even Democrats in the state of Florida came out to Ron DeSantis' defense, right? And in a highly polarized time that we live in, like anytime Democrats are defending Republicans or vice versa, you're like, okay, maybe they're telling the truth here, right? So even Democrats came out and supported Ron DeSantis. They said, look, this is not a story. It's kind of clunky. We know this information looks like it fits together, but it doesn't fit together. And here's actually the details. And they gave a lot of stuff. All right. Even CNN came out, right? So here's CNN Business. They talk about how 60 Minutes was facing some backlash. And then here's the letter that the Democrat mayor of the area of Palm Beach County sent to 60 Minutes and said, "Hey, like I'm the Democrat mayor of this town. Like you all screwed up this story. I'm a Democrat. Ron DeSantis is a Republican. Obviously we're not going to like each other during campaign season, but here's a moment where he actually did a really good thing as far as getting the vaccines into the pharmacies at the public grocery store. And really, it was a question of like, there's a lot of these grocery stores everywhere, so it was easy for older residents to get to these grocery stores, as opposed to like getting to a hospital, which might be further away. It's kind of like CVS or Walgreens around here. It's like there's one on every corner. It's like if you get them into the Publix grocery store, it's like everybody can get there within, I think everybody lives within like a mile of it or something when you do the math. All right, so 60 Minutes kind of screwed this story up, right? Sort of in a rush, because right now we're in the middle of a vaccine rollout, so they're trying to do stories on the vaccine rollout. In a couple months, they'll probably look back and they'll figure out the details, but as of right now, it looks as if they rushed together lots of things that didn't fit together. Okay. Another thing to remember is just like all media has bias. You're going to read about this in the article that I sent you on the Mike Tyson situation, which we'll briefly talk about, but you all have to read that article, right? And that's what you're going to write your paper on. But the thing about the media has bias, all media has bias, is that, look, even if the media is not partisan, even if it doesn't take a political position, it does get to pick what stories it wants to cover. So it can be biased and just sort of telling you what's important news to look at, okay? So, for instance, Fox News is going to ignore, Donald Trump's connections to Russia, and they're gonna like say like Hunter Biden, who's Joe Biden's son, is doing a lot of shady things over in Ukraine and connections with China, and he's doing cocaine and he's all the like they're gonna throw like Fox News is gonna talk about that a lot. Okay. On the reverse side, MSNBC is going to talk a lot about Donald Trump and Russia stuff, and they're not going to talk about some of the Hunter Biden, Joe Biden connections over in Ukraine and Russia and all this other kind of stuff, right? So the media doesn't have to be partisan as far as taking a side on an issue explicitly, but they are biased with regard to there's only so many hours in a day, and they get to choose how to spend that time. All right. So these two graphs up here are available on Vox.com, which is a new news organization. They probably even consider themselves, they're more left-leaning. It's an online website, but they have these little graphs that show you various, we'll call them President Trump scandals or potential scandals that happened during his presidency. And they just sort of show you how many minutes each news network talked about these issues, right? So Stormy Daniels, who was an adult film star who Donald Trump had an affair with, it's like MSNBC and CNN covered that a lot, right? And Fox News didn't cover it at all, right? So just the minutes that are devoted to various issues can sort of drive bias, all right? There's certain news stories out there that, depending on what cable news network you watch, you might not even know that those stories exist, just because the news organization you chose to watch never covers it. All right. So this is how the media becomes biased. Down here we have Chris Cuomo and Andrew Cuomo, who's the governor of New York. And Andrew Cuomo, during the coronavirus pandemic, he went on CNN every night, but he was being interviewed by his brother, which, if anybody knows anything about media ethics, that's a huge no-no. But CNN allowed it at the time. CNN has since gone back and said, like, we're not going to allow this anymore. But now the problem with that is that Andrew Cuomo is involved in a lot of scandal stuff with regard to how he handled the coronavirus situation and some nursing home stuff. And so he was on the news every night with CNN, but he was being interviewed by his brother. So imagine this, right? Andrew Cuomo he goes on CNN every night. He's the governor of New York, the hardest hit state with regard to coronavirus, like the most people being affected by coronavirus in April and May of last year, when like this stuff was hitting very hard. Everybody's in lockdown, everybody's freaked out, nobody knows what's going on. He goes on a major news network every night for like 30 minutes to talk to his brother, and his brother gets to decide, how do we spend that 30 minutes? And his brother could have like gone after him very, very hard. He could have gone after him and was like, tell me the numbers. What are you doing? Like, the state's in a mess. Like, what are like lockdowns? Like, his brother could have gone after him very, very hard. But instead, the criticism was his brother was very just treated him with kid gloves. Was very soft about it. Was like, let's make some jokes. Let's hang out. Let's have a little laugh. So you only get 30 minutes to interview the most powerful governor, or the most consequential governor in the United States at the time with regard to coronavirus, and deaths in New York City and all that kind of stuff. And the 30 minutes is just spent joking around as opposed to asking tough questions. All right. So this is how the media becomes biased. All right. So the media, it's not fair and balanced. It is biased because it chooses the stories, right? But just because it's biased doesn't mean that it's fake. It doesn't mean that these stories aren't true. It just means that some news organizations decide not to cover them, right? So when I try to do my stuff, this is some of the stuff I offered up to the teachers when I was doing this conference, right? Is just to make sure that we're sort of always showing the ways in which all media is biased, as opposed to just going after like Fox News all the time. I've had some colleagues. I've had a pretty interesting conversation. This was at an institution that I used to work at like 10 years ago, who would very explicitly say like she would never let her students use like Fox News as a source, but she would let them use MSNBC and CNN and everything else as sources. And she was just very vocal about that in the classroom. And I didn't think it was fair, right? I think you should be judging the news story based on the story as opposed to the source, right? There are plenty of biased sources, but we should just be aware that one of the reasons is if you do that to students and they think that everything on Fox News is fake, which it's not, right? But they also just kind of take their guard down and they say, oh, well, I saw it on CNN and MSNBC, and then they never question it, right? So if you want to be a good critical consumer, it's like you should sort of trust but verify all of your news sources. You should say, MSNBC is my favorite, news station. That's fine, but I'm not gonna just act as if everything that is on MSNBC is true all the time, because that would not that I wouldn't be a critical consumer then. All right, so you just want to make sure that you're sort of recognizing that all news media outlets sources do have their biases. There you have it. Okay, again, media, it all makes choices. In 2012, the president, Barack Obama, as well as the presidential candidate who was running against him for the Republican Party, Mitt Romney, they both had gaffes during their time there on the campaign trail. You can look these up. So, for instance, Mitt Romney made the following statement during an interview, I believe it was on Fox News. It was about a 10, 15-minute interview. He makes a statement. He says, I'm not concerned about the very poor. And you read that and you're like, oh my gosh, right? That's a terrible statement. He should not be president at all. But then you start digging in and you actually look at the interview and you realize that it was this big gaffe of him trying to explain his tax policy. And so if you read it in context, what he was saying was when we change the tax code around, if we raise taxes, for instance, he's like, I'm not concerned about the rich because the rich have money and they're going to be able to pay taxes. I'm not concerned about the very poor because the poor, if you make below, they don't pay tax. So what he's saying is like I'm not concerned about the poor's tax burden because their tax burden is always going to be zero. Like they're not going to pay additional taxes if we raise. And then he goes on. He's like I'm concerned about the middle class because the middle class is those individuals. An extra $100 or $200 a month in taxes could really affect their family's budget. So is it a poorly worded statement? Yeah. Is it in like a very wonky way? Is it factually correct? Yes, right? It's like the people who are very poor, if we raise or lower taxes, it doesn't affect their tax burden because they don't pay anything. The very, very rich, they're gonna keep being very, very rich, so it doesn't matter what we do with their taxes. But it's the middle class who, an extra $100 or $200, every month, it could make a difference. That's what he was trying to say. All right. President Obama also had this gaffe where he said, if you got a business, you didn't build that. And he was trying to make this larger point about like, if you have a business, you had teachers who taught you how to do things, you had parents who supported you, you had a bank that loaned you money, you have, people in your community who pay taxes, they make roads so that you can get your product from point A to point B. Like, that's what he was saying. He was very much like, it takes a village to raise a child kind of thing, right? But if you take this quote out of context, it looks really awful, right? And there's a lot of sort of small business people that were like, what are you talking about? You're just a politician. I work, 70 hours a week, and I invested my life savings in this. How dare you say that I didn't build my own company? Blah, blah, blah. All right. Both of these are poorly worded statements, but this is what the media does. If you like the candidate, you're never going to show these gaffes, right? If you do like the candidate, or if you don't like the candidate, you're going to sort of show these gaffes on repeat. Your job as a critical media consumer now is to go in and say, look, like I saw Mitt Romney said something very terrible. Let me go read the entire speech because maybe there's more behind it than what this gaffe is, right? So this is what you have to be careful of. The media gets to choose how they snip and edit pieces together. And because of that, they can kind of show you whatever it is they want. Down below, I have this clip from this Survivor show called Man vs. Wild. You all might be familiar with, and it's a funny little clip that shows you how Man vs. Wild, how some of it's staged sometimes, right? So we kind of focus in on like this guy's in the wilderness and he's gonna die if he doesn't get to civilization. Watch the clip below because then it shows you sort of like a 360 view of like what wild is he in, and it ends up being he's like in the middle of a city, but we just happen to like zoom in on the part that looks like wild, a wild time, when really it's like there's a McDonald's right down the road and he's fine. He's not starving in the middle of nowhere. So you can watch that clip down below and just sort of recognize like the news can do that too. The news can take a small little clip out of a long speech and make it sound as if that person is a horrible person, when really it's like listen to the entire speech and contextually it makes sense and it's not that big of a deal. Okay, again, the media happens in 2 dimensions, but we live in a 3-dimensional world, so the media always gets to sort of zoom in their camera lens and focus on the pictures they want you to. This is what's known as revealed versus concealed. So the media gets to reveal certain images to you, and they get to conceal images that they don't want you to see. And I have some more examples later on about this, right? You always want to look at what's happening outside the frame, or think about what could be happening outside the frame. So the media creates what's known as oppositional metaphors, which means instead of saying like this group is right and I think this group is wrong, what they do is say like our group is right and morally righteous and that other group is evil. Right? So it's not just like if you side with those other people, you're actually logically incorrect. It's like if you side with those other people, you are a degenerate. You're like an evil, immoral person. All right? So 10 years ago or so, right, we had these groups like the Tea Party and Occupy Wall Street. Tea Party was more Republican, conservative. Occupy Wall Street more left liberal, right? And depending on what news organization you turned on, you're going to see very different versions of who these individuals were. So the Tea Party, for instance, MSNBC would probably like focus in on like the one lady who's holding a sign, and this got edited back, but what she says is it says cap Congress and trade Obama back to Kenya. So she was doing this whole like Obama's a Kenya birther kind of stuff. That's a horrible lady, right? It's a horrible sign. She might be a nice lady who might be very, very misinformed. All right, that's a horrible sign. However, the media, right, depending on which what agenda they have, they could focus in and just take the picture of that lady and say, look, everybody who's at this rally is represented in this lady. If I'm more Fox News, I might say, I'm not even going to show that sign. I'm going to show a rational person over here who's not saying, Looney Tune stuff. All right. Occupy Wall Street, lots of people involved with that, but, there were some people there who were burning American flags. I could either show that or not show that to you, the media consumer, based on what message I wanted you to learn about Occupy Wall Street. I knew people involved in both the Tea Party, and I knew people who were involved in Occupy Wall Street who were great people, right? Who had differences with me in various regards, but they were good people, okay? The media focuses in on 2-dimensional pictures. I don't know if there's 1,000 people at this rally or if there's 1,000,000 people at this rally. All I know is that the media focuses in on a small image of, and they get to choose what picture they put on TV, right? And they could choose a good picture that helps the cause. They could choose a bad picture that makes the cause look, xenophobic, like this woman who says, Obama should go back to Kenya kind of thing. So the advice I always give students is if you have never been to either political rally or if there's a political group that you're unfamiliar with, it's like you should go to those you should go to those protests, you should go to those meetings, you should meet those individuals. We can learn about them through the TV, but we have to remember that the TV gets to make choices with regard to what images they show us, and they might show us the most cartoonish caricature versions of these protest incidents. All right, so a couple ideas here. So some exercises I used to do in class, which I'll probably pick it back up in the fall once we get out of this COVID stuff. So I used to ask students, like, how many of you had an opinion about the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, right down here? How many of you had an opinion about Trump's immigration executive order, right? How many of you have an opinion about current tax policies? How many of you have opinions about the current Georgia election law that's in the news right now, and people are saying it's good, some people are saying it's bad. Major League Baseball has moved like baseball games out of there now. Like, do you have an opinion about the current Georgia election law? All right. And usually when I bring up these, political issues, usually the class is pretty split, half and half, whether or not they like them or don't. The classes are pretty balanced, like students who are more conservative versus more liberal, right? Here's the follow-up question I always have for students. So let's take the Georgia election law. Do you have an opinion about it? Think for a second, like, do you have an opinion about Georgia's new election law, right? And this is the question I would ask you if you're in my class right now. How many have read Georgia's new election law, right? And my guess is that none of you have, right? My guess is that you have your opinion about the law based on the news that you watch, all right? So when people say, how is it that you could support the Georgia election law? It's like, well, that person's probably only watching news that says the Georgia election law is great. And then there's some people who are like, how could this Georgia election law is terrible? And it's like, you've probably only watched news that says it's terrible. So if you know that the news is limited, if you know that the news only shows you what the news wants to show you, and it doesn't show you everything, maybe you should be a little bit more critically minded and say, I'm going to go read these documents by myself. All right. So you want to start thinking about, like, where did I get my information? If my information didn't come from reading the actual laws that were passed, my information came from a news source. And do I know that sometimes news sources give me bad information? Yeah, we know that sometimes news sources apologize or make corrections. Does the person that gives me the news, do they probably have a political agenda? They probably do. Do news organizations get to pick and choose the stories they tell us? Yeah, absolutely. So you can't just, it's not a question of trusting or not trusting. It's just a question of sort of recognizing that, if you want to be a robot, then go ahead and just parrot all of the talking points that someone has given you. But if you want to be a critical, independent thinker, watch your favorite news source, but then go and read the actual material, right? And sometimes you're going to find, like, oh, actually, I think this is a pretty good bill, or I think it's a very terrible bill, right? You might have difference of opinions with regard to your favorite news source. But if your information is always like, I watch it on the news, the more you learn about, the news gets to kind of skew itself based on who its anchors are. Anchors, they vote for presidents too. They get to choose which news stories, right? You go back to that Vox thing. It's like sometimes Fox News is not telling you, it's not that Fox News is lying about Stormy Daniels. It's just that they're not even going to talk to you about Stormy Daniels, all right? So just kind of keep that in mind. And so if you do have an opinion about these things, you want to think, like, why do I have this opinion? Well, I got it secondhand, and maybe I should go back and read the original version myself, and then I can be a more informed person. All right. Another example. This is relevant now. The last couple of days, there's been some more protest and or rioting, right? And I'm going to say both because, again, it depends on where you get your news. So this is an example that I use. This is actually from Ferguson, Missouri, when some of the Black Lives Matter stuff started to kind of come into fruition about 5-6 years ago. So let's imagine that I'm a newspaper editor, all right? And I write up a story about some of the current protests / riots that are happening in the country around the issue of Black Lives Matter situation, all right? My photo person brings me back multiple pictures of what they captured on film, and I have to run a front page story with a front page picture that day. All right. Which picture am I going to use? Both of these pictures are accurate representations of one moment in time when these protests were happening. I'm a newspaper editor. All right. If I show this picture of a bunch of hooligans, right, probably late teens, early 20s, right, smashing over a cop car, that's going to tell my readers one story. It's going to give my readers a specific impression about Black Lives Matter, right? If I decide to run this down here, which a bunch of protests, peacefully protesting, this is what they call a die-in, right, where they're sort of laying on the ground, they're putting their hands up, they're laying in the middle of the road, right? So this, that's gonna give you a different impression with regard to what Black Lives Matter is all about, right? So if you're a person, you like Black Lives Matter, you don't like Black Lives Matter, you have to recognize that unless you've actually been to a protest or a rally or a part of what, it's like you are getting the images with regard to what these events are like based on the pictures that are shown on the news. And an editor gets to decide, do they show this picture? And look, if I see this picture every day, I'm like, screw these, like, screw this. Like, this is ridiculous. Like, I don't want people smashing up cop cars and acting ridiculous and, the looting stores and everybody going into, Nike and stealing a bunch of sneakers and Foot Locker. Like, no, like, I have zero support then. If I see this image every day, yeah, I'm going to have a story that's like, yeah, this is fantastic. This is peaceful protest. This is totally within the sort of American tradition of peaceful assembly and, redress of grievances and like 100% support, right? But depending on the picture that is shown to me in the news, I have different impressions. All right. And that creates a long-term story for whether or not I support or don't support the movement. All right. So this is important with regard to how media bias starts to manifest. All right. So I need you all to understand, the lengthy, nuanced, and complicated documents, interviews that are edited in time for press. Right. So Trump's immigration bill gets edited down to about 3 lines for a news story. It's like, realize like that's contextual. A photojournalist goes out and takes 1,000 pictures in one night, and the newspaper editor chooses one to put on the front page. It's like there's probably like 999 photos there that are telling different, more complicated, nuanced stories of what actually happened. Did peaceful protest happen? Yes. Did hooligans create a lot of chaos and set stuff on fire and break? Yeah, that happened too, all right? So you want to be that person who understands the whole story. You don't want to be that robot who just is like, oh, I just saw that one image on my preferred news channel and now I think I know everything. You don't, all right? You know what the news wanted to tell you, all right? This is not always malicious as far as like news organizations. They're not malicious with regard to the edits, right? But look, you have to, they do have time, right? There's only so many pictures you can run in the newspaper. There's only so many interviews you can show on the nightly news. So, but you have to recognize that I can make anything sound really, really good or really, really bad based on what I pull from it, right? I can make if President Joe Biden gives a speech today for 30 minutes, I can make it sound incredible if I pull out the 2 minutes where he sounds incredible. I can make it sound stupid if I pull out the 2 minutes where he's fumbling and stumbling and stuttering over his words. All right, but that's a 30-minute speech. And I can make anybody look amazing in 30 minutes or somebody look terrible in 30 minutes. All right, so just keep that in mind when it comes to understanding how news is edited. All right, so again, you want to be in the habit of trust but verify. So you like your favorite news anchor, cool, continue to watch your cable news network of choice, but just remember that there are more contextual elements that go into the story than what they're just showing you. Did this picture happen at a BLM protest? Yes, it did. So did this one. Contextualize these things. Back to the original discussion a few slides back with Governor DeSantis in Florida and the coronavirus vaccine rollout. One of the ways that 60 Minutes kind of screwed up is that they only played 20 seconds with a lot of little edits, and DeSantis gave a 2-minute and 20-second response. So again, 60 Minutes sort of pulled out some clips that just sort of helped better fit in this puzzle they were trying to do. And it's like, look, he gave a 2-minute and 20-second response. It was far more complicated and nuanced with regard to how the vaccines got into the Publix grocery store pharmacy than what CNN allowed for. And CNN had to make editing choices. I get that. However, just sort of remember that this is how it always works. The Affordable Care Act, which is also known as Obamacare, it's 906 pages. So if you're a person who's like, I love it, I hate it, it's like you probably know like three things about it. It's a very long bill. So to say like, I love it because somebody on TV told me to love it, that's very sheepish behavior of you. All right. Trump's immigration executive order is even more. I find it even more egregious when people have like strong opinions about this and they haven't read it because this is only a page and a half. So when people are like, I love it because Trump is awesome, or people are like, I hate it because everything Trump does is awful. I'm like, have you read this? And they're like, no, I didn't read it. I'm like, you should read it and then you can be a more informed person. All right. Okay. Media literacy, encourage reading by showing students how they can be easily misled by not reading. All right. I can give you lots of examples of how you all have been misled because you haven't read the entire story. Okay. This happens a lot. So up here, this is actually an MSNBC story who is more left-leaning network. They like Joe Biden over Donald Trump, for instance. But even they, with the Georgia law, Joe Biden has come out and it's called it like Jim Crow, like 2.0 kind of stuff. And even MSNBC is like, look, the Georgia election law, it has some good things and some bad things, but Biden, you need to kind of pump the brakes a little bit. You're kind of overshooting the mark here. Like, be honest with what it is. Like, it's not as like egregious as it sounds, so you just kind of need to tamper it back, right? So again, you like the Georgia law or not or don't like it, that's fine, but just make sure you read it because you can be very, very misled by the media when you don't read stuff, right? Trump's immigration law, Black Lives Matter, is it good? Is it bad? These protests, what is happening? You are misled if you are not reading stuff on your own. All right. Make sure you read the full story. Make sure you read the policy of the law. Find the original uncut interview. So again, with that, Ron DeSantis situation, it's like watch the full 2.5 minute exchange as opposed to the 20 seconds that 60 minutes had, and you're just going to get a very different impression about what happened. All right. I prefer watching C-SPAN when it comes to politicians because on C-SPAN they're allowed to talk for 15 to 30 minutes at a time. If you're just watching cable news, it's like two people yelling at each other for 2 minutes and then they go to commercial. I have no idea what your policy position is if you just yelled at somebody else about it for 2 minutes. C-SPAN, they do full like 15 to 30 minute interviews or like fully explain your bill, your position. This will give you more information. All right. And then generate context by reading lots of books. So put these things in sort of historical positions. All right. A couple sad things, right? Literacy is on the decline. Most adults don't read anymore. Only 43% of adults have read part of a book in the last year. That doesn't even mean they got through the entire book. It just means they read part of a book. So, I mean, if you just read books, you have an advantage automatically from over 60%, over 60% of the rest of the public. Okay. This little thing, I'm sorry, my face is in the way, but what this is it's an email. Anytime you see a news put something up and they have like three little dots, so the dots are behind my head, but they say like, here's an email from Donald Trump Jr. and they have these little three, here's half the email that I'm going to put ... and put the rest of the email. That doesn't work out because I want to know what's in the full email. So Fox News gets to choose what parts of the email to show or not. Anytime you see this little ellipsis, it just means they're leaving stuff out. Now, it could be inconsequential. They might be leaving it out for a good reason, but just make sure you kind of go back and read the full email so that you know whether or not Fox News cut something out that was actually very consequential and important. All right, reading is foundational for media literacy. We must make reading past the headlines a concept in our classrooms, and don't just say like, well, students don't read and make that some sort of an excuse. You have to read past the headlines. Headlines can say anything they want. It's like you got to read the full story and sort of broaden your understanding. If you read something from the New York Times, try to go read the same story that's printed on CNN or Fox. Like read multiple sources with regard to the same story so that you can kind of piece it all together. All right. And finally, I'm going to put these clips below. Okay. And this is what I want you to do because this will be in the context of the Mike Tyson article that you are reading for class. Okay. So in all three of these cases, Mike Tyson, Kobe Bryant, and Duke Lacrosse, these all involve high-profile sexual assault cases. All right. And this isn't a guilty or innocent thing. We'll talk about this more in class when we discuss it. So my purpose here isn't to have you sort of read these and be like, okay, I know who's guilty and innocent now. My purpose for you watching these is to just sort of take note of who is talking in these clips and who's not talking in these clips, right? How are these people talking about themselves? How are people talking about other people? So for instance, like one thing that I find really, really interesting in all of these cases is, for instance, we all know who Mike Tyson is, right? And when I talk to students, especially, younger students now, we're getting further and further away from it. Very few of them know that he spent 2.5 years in jail in the early 90s at the prime of his career for sexual assault, all right? And if some students know that, then I say, okay, well, what's the name of the young woman who accused him and then he was ultimately convicted of sexually assaulting? Nobody knows her name. Same is true with Kobe Bryant. In 2006, 2005, 2006, Kobe Bryant was accused of sexual assault. We all know who Kobe Bryant is. We don't know this young woman's name. So one thing that I like to just sort of show students in these clips is that all of these people who are in these clips are high profile, and Mike Tyson, in this instance, for instance, like he's giving an interview on CNN about how he's innocent. And I'm totally fine with him going on CNN and he's give a 5-minute interview to say, I'm innocent, I'm innocent, I'm innocent. But then CNN doesn't have, the next segment should be CNN doing a 5-minute interview with somebody who, like, either the woman who accused him or like her lawyer or somebody, a victim's advocate, to tell us why he's not innocent, to tell us why he's guilty, right? So this is what's interesting in the news, is they can do a 5-minute segment where they say, here's a person who wants to claim their innocence, and then they'll say, okay, now that's it, that's the whole story. And with these situations, it's like we know these high profile people, but they're never interviewed they never interview the other side. So with Kobe Bryant, does this press conference, but then nobody interviews the young woman who accused him, right? Or again, her lawyer or something, if she doesn't want to interview, she doesn't want to be interviewed. In the Duke Lacrosse case, you'll watch this 60 minutes clip. Just watch the first 30 seconds, and you'll see them say, like, we sat down with the Duke Lacrosse players to interview them about this sexual assault thing that they're facing, and they never interview the woman who is accusing them of sexual assault at a party, all right? So, again, I'm not concerned about guilt or innocence. I just want you to sort of look at this and realize how interesting and weird it is that these major news networks go around and they interview people and say, tell us your side of the story, and then Mike Tyson talks on CNN for 5 minutes, and then CNN's like, okay, I guess we're done. No, like CNN, you should do 5 minutes with Mike Tyson, and then if you want to give people context and help, like, have 5 minutes with, either the person who accused him or her lawyers or whatever, so that people sort of fully understand the story. But instead, CNN gets to choose which side of the story they want to promote based on who they give a microphone to. All right, so that's part of the article. Read the article. It's located on Canvas. Watch the quick clip from the Survivor Man Bear Grylls thing down below, and you will see how the media just sort of constantly gets to kind of manipulate and shift the narrative and tell you whatever narrative they want. And oftentimes they just sort of leave stuff out if it's not convenient for them, all right, which is based on these clips. And I'll put all 3 of these clips down below. Okay, that's all I got.